All right, we're going to go ahead and get this conversation started. Hello and welcome to another Mathematic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the medtech industry, primarily in New England, through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Today, I am pleased to introduce a webinar on healthier at home, develop hospital to home solutions that deliver value for all. We have an amazing panel of industry experts brought to you by PA Consulting, and I'm really excited to jump into the conversation. But before we do, I just have a few quick housekeeping notes. Anyone who registered for the webinar will receive a recording of the webinar after. And we do have time for Q&A. So please, anytime a question occurs to you, please put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to make sure we get to all those questions. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn the conversation over to our moderator for today, Alistair Fleming from PA Consulting.
Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our session today. I'm Alistair Fleming. I'm a partner at PA Consulting, where I work with clients across the life science sector to help accelerate innovation. I'm really excited to be our host today to guide you through what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion around the successful delivery of at-home health solutions. Our speakers today represent a diverse range of interests from within the field, and I'm looking forward to hearing how they are navigating this complex ecosystem and delivering value. Nicole has admirably covered off the logistics. Just to quickly recap though, we do have a Q&A at the end, and we'd love your input as you go along. Do feel free to drop questions into the Q&A section on Zoom. We're also quite keen to encourage your further participation with a couple of simple multiple choice Zoom polls. In fact, we figured that might be a good way to kick things off. So, to test our collective mastery of Zoom, what I might suggest is fingers at the ready. Earlier this year, we conducted a survey. It was of healthcare and pharma and medtech organizations. One of the questions was, what are the most significant advantages of moving to at-home services? Is it improved patient experience, improved clinical outcomes, or increased availability of real-world data? We've kept this one quite simple by only giving you these three options. So don't sweat it, gut feel. From these choices, what do you think? We will be holding back the answers to this one until the end of the session. Meanwhile, let's dive in. Migration of care to a lower intensity setting and ultimately out of a clinical environment and into the home is now a well-established trend, promising many benefits. And this isn't a spoiler for the poll results. Things like cost savings, improved health equity, patient convenience, and the potential for improved outcomes. But achieving this shift is not short of its challenges. Working with clients in this space, earlier this year, we at PA Consulting wanted to better understand some of the key headwinds and opportunities, and this led us to commissioning a wide-ranging piece of research across hospitals, pharma, and medtech communities. We'll drop a link to our report into the feed, but there were a couple of aspects that we felt were deserving of closer scrutiny. Firstly, the challenge of introducing new practices into a highly complex ecosystem. I'm sure most of you are no strangers to many of these issues: patient engagement, value recognition, extending reimbursement codes. But making changes to care pathways also means you need to plan ahead for unanticipated consequences. There's a requirement to evidence risk and to untangle conflicting demands. The second topic we were going to cover, whilst we found quite a lot of excitement and activity, obviously, we also picked up from the clinical community, particularly, some reservations and concerns. So where is the data to support this shift? What's an individual's motivation to change ingrained practices? So to help us unpack this and explore perspectives from some of these leading trends, I have great pleasure to introduce you to our expert panel. Firstly, Tahir Haq. Senior Medical Director at Bioformis, as well as practicing physician at Brigham Women's Hospital. Alex Gilbert, VP medtech at digital health technology company Humor. Chris Henderson, Global Senior Director of Digital Health and Value-Based Solutions for Smith & Nephew. And Melanie Churio, Life Science Partner with PA Consulting. So panel, bios will be available, I think, on the MassMedic website. So let's focus on your motivations and interests, a chance for you to introduce yourselves and give us a little of your journey. And let us know what makes you passionate about what you're doing in this space. Tahir, may I start with you?
Sure, it's nice to meet everyone and thank you for having me here. As Alistair mentioned, I'm a physician by practice. I specialize in internal medicine. I practice in a hospital at home program. My work predominantly focuses on innovative care delivery models. I have a passion for being able to provide care to all patients, regardless of their financial means or the resources available to them, and optimizing the care they get so that we can improve outcomes. It's nice to meet all of you.
Thanks to hear. And Chris.
Hi everybody, good to see you all. So I'm Chris Henderson. So I head up our digital health and value-based solutions group at Smith & Nephew. So I suppose very sort of quick history of myself. So big sort of data geek by history, big fascination with medical technologies, and I suppose the vision that I see in the future is I think we're all on a collective health journey towards understanding how do we sustain access to effective, equitable care for patients, no matter where they are, right? Whether that's in hospital or at home. And I think, as we're all going through that collective health journey, I think we all have lots to share. And so for me, a big vision that I have is understanding how do we democratize access to care for patients through connecting people with technology and data. So lots of information to share, but we're looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, Alistair.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Melanie, would you like to go next? You'll have to drop off mute there. Sorry, I caught you out.
Of course I will. Yeah, have to drop off mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you, Alistair, and it's nice to see everybody. And my interest in this space, I'm a human-centered design professional by background and training, and so I tend to take a very patient-centric lens on medtech and healthcare. And I can see and appreciate all the potential benefits, but there's two particular reasons why this space has been of interest to me. I was personally motivated to think a little bit more deeply about the challenges here because of my mom, who was a visiting nurse for a long time, and the stories that she would share about the challenges, both for patients and from her own perspective as a healthcare provider, were highly compelling. I mean, clearly there's room for improvement, and there are some important problems to be worked on. And the reason that it's important is because, like Chris mentioned, I also am interested in the health equity aspect of this space. I really believe that shifting care from clinical to home settings and the technologies that enable that are going to be one of the greatest drivers of improved health access and equity in the near future. So this is important and timely.
Superb. Thanks, Melanie. And finally, Alex.
Thanks, Alistair. So hi everybody, Alex Gilbert. I lead the medtech business at Humor, and I've been here for just over 6.5 years, mostly helping us to establish the methods in which we partner with both life sciences and healthcare organizations and essentially digitize clinics via various different routes. The main reason that I moved into the space and kind of a big passion is definitely, as Melanie and Chris were mentioning, equity for sure, and definitely how we can empower and engage patients to take a controlling role within their care. I think that the shifting nature of the care ecosystem is requiring patients to take on more responsibility. And I think there's a big opportunity in digital health to then allow them to maximize on that opportunity and be in the driver's seat, with the healthcare system acting more in the role of an advisor and kind of mentor almost. So that's very much kind of my focus as well in Humor, is kind of how do we essentially drive that forward with our partnerships with other organizations.
Brilliant. Thanks, panel. That's great to hear your backgrounds and interests, and a lot of alignment there as well. No surprise, really. So it's great to see voices from I think several parts of the ecosystem here today. Of course, if we were to try and represent all the major stakeholder categories of relevance, I think we'd probably struggle to get past the intros in the time we've got. And that's kind of part of the challenge, really, as we see it, the complex web of systems, practices, interested parties that can be a challenge to navigate from the outside, I dare say from the inside as well. A statistic from our survey that stood out was that 65% of respondents said that pharma and medtech lacks an understanding of healthcare systems and care pathways, and that this was a barrier to scaling adoption of hospital-at-home solutions. And that number, by the way, made it the highest single reported obstacle in our survey. So from your differing vantage points, it would be great to get your views on this panel. Perhaps, Alex, could I turn to you first? I understand Humour acts as something of a bridge to help your clients across and access that healthcare system. That must mean you're taking a bit of the heavy lifting for them in some respects. So how do you guys solve that? How do you navigate the system? What have you found challenging, and how have you tackled it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one thing that's for certain is that each time is its own collection of problems and issues. And each time we establish a new partnership or go in a new direction or even go into a new disease area, we kind of have a new situation that we have to navigate. And I think the key trends really have been, we have to ensure that we have a very strong level of patient focus. So actually having an understanding of the issues that a patient is facing in reality, which means actually talking to patients and getting their feedback, usually results in more engaging programs, which are ultimately then successful. If you're able to get that patient engagement, that's really what then allows you to achieve a high level of success with the clinics as well. You know, if they see that kind of patients are responding, if the patients are engaging with digital solutions, if they're willing to contribute, the clinic in turn will in many instances then also adopt the solution. Now, what's been complex for us is, you know, as you said, we kind of have these kind of matrix partnerships almost, where we act as kind of the digital health provider. We have a life sciences company like, you know, pharmaceutical, biotech, medtech. Smith & Nephew is a good example, but we also work with businesses like Bayer, AstraZeneca, and various others who essentially want to be able to leverage digital health to impact a realistic care pathway. And then we have health systems that are very diverse from country to country, acting in different ways. And I think what we found beneficial is establishing those partnerships with key success metrics in mind that then reflect the key success metrics of the hospital. So it's essential to create these almost win-win-win type situations where both the patient wins, the provider wins, and the life sciences organization wins. And it's only then that you can really get adoption at scale. And we have some programs that have gotten to that point, you know, they're launched in 15 different countries, and we're seeing, you know, large in the thousands patient numbers, but only where we've actually been able to be realistic and align on what those success factors and win factors are.
Yeah, nice. Interesting. You mentioned the international element there. I imagine from the perspective of the complexities of ecosystems, each country has its own nuances. Is that a unique challenge as well, that you have to tailor those solutions into each geography?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, I think there's two elements. That one is every country for sure is different. And even then, every country doesn't exactly know how to place digital health yet. Even though the industry is maturing, we're still not at a place where things like reimbursement or reg or kind of various things are kind of super cut and clear for a digital health organization. So, you know, we just recently, well, a couple of months ago, became a Class 2B medical device. And that was something that we had never previously thought would even be necessary or an option, but due to change in the regulatory space, became, you know, more or less essential. Now, most of our competitors within the space haven't necessarily achieved that because it's not something that the clients are asking for yet, because they in turn don't know that it's something that they should be asking for. So there's definitely a kind of lot of learning happening, which I think is very positive, but it does require a lot of problem solving if you're going to focus on diversity of deployment when you're talking about a geographic scope.
Yeah, makes sense. So here, perhaps turning to yourself, Bioformis sits a little closer to the provider, I guess, but I'm assuming must have similar challenges. What sort of difficulties have you faced getting under the hood of the systems you're integrating with?
Yeah, I want to highlight kind of what Alex touched on earlier, in that each health system is unique, and understanding these nuances across our different customers is key to launching a successful program. So I want to elaborate further on what I mean by unique. And unique doesn't necessarily just mean the reason why the system is creating the hospital to home program. And that could be to address capacity issues, drive innovative care delivery, push towards value-based care, or a combination of what I mentioned above. But it also includes factors which make the health system unique, such as geographic location, their provider demographic, the patient population they serve, the existing solutions that they already use within the system, and the list kind of goes on. So the challenge for Bioformis and every other medtech company when entering a health system is, how do we make a solution that fits into the existing system and makes the overall system's care delivery better, rather than me throwing an out-of-box solution and hoping that it sticks within an already delicate and fragmented system and hope that I get some use out of it. So the change in mindset that's needed for medtech companies is to really understand that healthcare is not always linear. It's not a direct-to-consumer business, which can lead to obviously competing interests between all of the different parties involved. And that includes not only the patients, but the providers, the health system executives, government officials, payers, and pharmaceutical companies. So to try and understand a health system and fit into that already complex puzzle of care delivery, we keep a lot of themes in mind that you actually mentioned in your report, Alistair. That includes experience, equity, intentionality. And so Bioformis doesn't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach, and we've made a configurable and modular solution that doesn't disrupt workflows and hopefully joins the siloed ones that are already in place. And in situations where we're replacing an existing solution, it becomes even more complex, because then the onus is on Bioformis to not only replace it with something better, but specifically replace it with something better that works for the people that use it for that health system. So again, I'll emphasize, it's all about the experience, and to understand that experience, a solution has to be built for the people who use it, but also by the people who use it. And they're the ones who understand what it will take to get that stakeholder buy-in so that program can grow.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So I guess you have a little bit of an advantage in so far as you have one foot in both camps yourself. But I'm guessing that's only part of the solution. You must spend a lot of time talking to the various stakeholders to make sure that it suits each of their individual needs.
Absolutely. It helps kind of being on both sides of the equation as a product lead in a medtech company, but then also a physician who practices in a hospital at home program. And as you mentioned, provider and stakeholder buy-in is irreplaceable. And I like to think of myself having that advantage, being in both camps, because when I implement such solutions at customer sites, I serve as a go-between between the two parties involved. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight why this is important. So as a physician, I actually have to use the solutions that get implemented in our program. And I'm hyper aware, just like a lot of my other colleagues in the program, when I have to do something that now takes 5 clicks as opposed to the 1 click that it used to take previously. So let's just say ordering a medication. And as many of you know, in a group of healthcare providers that's already kind of change resistant or change averse, that probably doesn't bode well. So I've said this a lot of times in other forums, but I think it's important to reiterate, hospital at home is a blank whiteboard, and you have the chance to really build a program that suits your needs and works near perfectly for the patients that are receiving that care. And so if you think about changing things in a hospital is extremely difficult. You have a pre-existing building, you have a pool of employees that have already been hired, and pre-built technical systems. So think about the effort that it takes to add a new wing to a hospital or to replace an already existing EMR system. It's extremely expensive, and it's usually a forced adoption that has a suboptimal experience. So with Hospital at Home, you have the chance to build something that makes sense and that works for all of the different parties involved. So Bioformis really prides itself on engaging directly with health systems, the providers, and the different stakeholders to take what they need and translate that into a product that works for them. And I think of myself as that person who tries to understand the need of the provider or the stakeholders and translate that to the product and engineering teams at Bioformis to design something that's seamless.
Brilliant, thanks to hear. It's really interesting, actually. You're, as I say, relatively unusual insofar as you're both on the development side and on the user side. I think most of us in medtech are grateful that we're not usually users of our products, but it's useful having that feedback. Chris, perhaps I'll turn to yourself. I guess one might suppose that for Smith & Nephew, the challenge is tougher. For Tahir and Alex, it's part of their day job, but for Smith & Nephew, your traditional business is providing products into existing care settings. So I guess there's a bit of a process of change and internal education required. How have you approached these new challenges?
Yeah, I guess on that, but no, I'm probably the usual medtech provider, right? So I suppose I'll start with giving a bit of context. So Smith & Nephew, founded in 1856. So I said 1856. So, business over 160 years old. So, if we're going to be talking about, relative maturity, I suppose we're the oldest startup, safe to say, on the call. But yeah, I suppose, based off a business which is over 160 years old, we've built a business model and a successful business model that, we build, develop, deploy, and provide medical device solutions across many different therapeutic areas, so many different markets around the world. And that's testament to where we are today. But to your point, Alistair, we have to sustain that business model in order to continue to provide solutions for our patients. But also we have a very clear eye on how the market is changing and evolving, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a transition of site of care. And so, this whole pivot from hospital to home not only disrupts our kind of current lens of where we need to play, but it also changes our perspective of the types of technologies that we need to think about deploying in the future. And a little bit of that comes into, and I think the statistic that you mentioned at the start of this conversation was 60%, there's a challenge there. And I think, Smith & Nephew are probably a few spaces removed from the home care setting and direct to patient level interactions, right? And so we have to lean on third-party partnerships and technology and native businesses like Humor or Bioformis to help explore that space. And I suppose the comfort blanket of our current business model will only last so long. And so we have to work in partnership with these types of organizations to define the sort of path forward and really understand how do we ensure the products and services that we provide to our customers, and those customers now increasingly being patients, or as I like to refer, consumers, in their own setting, right? So I think there is a change intrinsically that are driven by those market forces. And I suppose the inference, as you mentioned earlier, around educating the organization is just really about raising up that sort of patient centricity within our organization, not just the patient themselves, but the home care setting. And actually that environment is totally different. As we all know, we all have a home, we all are patients, we all are consumers, right? So I think we know that there's very clear differences there. And so that's this type of thing we have to think about in terms of understanding how do we make sure that the products, services, and solutions that we're providing are effective, sustainable, equitable in those settings. And that, in order for us to understand whether they are having the impact we feel they should do, what type of data can we sort of extract from that setting, and how do we work in partnership with our health system providers as well? So hopefully that gives a little bit of context. But we are on the journey, hence the conversation today. So
yeah, that's really interesting, Chris. And you talk about the journey. I suppose it would be interesting to reflect on your views of whether you see companies like Smith & Nephew continuing down the collaboration route as you're describing as that sort of vehicle to access the markets, or whether ultimately over time there'll be consolidation such that you have more vertical integration there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's ultimately a strategic decision, right? I think for me, the digital space is moving so rapidly, and I think we're seeing very clear markers in market around things like pair therapeutics. We're seeing these things happen in market where we see these big organizations, and they're coming unstuck in terms of reimbursement, payers, etc. And so I think as the market matures and stabilizes in some key areas, I think it will naturally give us that strategic focus and where we can balance risk with investment and balance risk on return as well. But ultimately also operate in areas where we have strategic alignment and that we feel that we can add value, right? Because I think the challenge with digital health is not only is it fast moving, but there's lots of flashy, shiny lights of things that are really exciting, and then all of a sudden they don't mean anything. And so, 12 months ago, we weren't even talking about ChatGPT. Now it seems to be in every single healthcare solution we can ever dream of. And so, we have to be mindful of the velocity of the market, but also being explicitly pragmatic in terms of where we should invest and what gives Smith & Nephew or any other medtech or pharma business the right to play and succeed in that space, where other native digital businesses are probably much more on the front lines with patients, developing with providers as well. So I think there's an element of pragmatism, but there's a very keen eye on understanding where we should and could add that broader value, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. Useful. One other point I quickly wanted to pick up with you, Chris. I was intrigued. You mentioned previously about working with data with hospitals, and I think Smith & Nephew has something of a sort of consulting arrangement sometimes with hospitals to help them make better use of their own data. It's an interesting flip almost in terms of how you navigate the system. I was interested to hear how that works for you and whether it's how it fits with the business model.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we provide solutions across advanced wound management, orthopedics, sports medicine, etc. And I think the challenge that I think all medtech and pharma businesses are up against is more patients, fewer carers, less skills, less time, less money, and effectively that compounds itself in making sure we can give the right patient the right product at the right time. I'm throwing loads of cliches at you, by the way. But ultimately, it's making sure that our products deliver the right outcomes that we believe they should, right? And so, if you take an area like surgical site complications and trying to mitigate those, we know we have great products that, if used on the right patient, can have a phenomenal outcomes for patients and healthcare providers and payers. But quite a lot of the time, when we engage with health systems, they're still on their own change and that change transformation journey. And so we tend to now evolve our business models to be much more focused on how do we provide much more transparency on your care delivery model, what's working well, what's not working so well, and how can Smith & Nephew forge a deeper partnership with you to help you not only get a better understanding of where your patient population is at, but how do we help structure a care delivery model with you that is aiming to achieve those outcomes that we believe you can achieve, right? So I suppose inherently within that, we offer increasing services around practice reviews. We do sort of clinical audits, and that's really about opening up a whole new lens on care delivery, patient outcomes, and ultimately opportunities to drive better outcomes at a lower cost. And so we feel our role as a medtech player is evolving, and it needs to evolve. And ultimately, the 160-year-old business model kind of takes care of itself, right? But I think we need to make sure that we provide that broader value to our health system partners now.
Fascinating. Thanks, Chris. Melanie, I think turning to yourself, PA is lucky enough to work with providers, payers, pharma, medtech. So we've got a fair bit of useful experience to draw upon, but I imagine there's no substitute for a tailored approach to each scenario that presents itself. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, pulling a couple of themes from the things that, Alex and Chris and Tahir have just talked about, variability and stakeholders, I think, are two of those key themes. Alex talked about variability of healthcare systems across geographies, and Chris talked about the variability of the environment that you're dealing with, once you've moved outside a clinical setting, which, of course, there's some variability from healthcare system to healthcare system, but it's reasonably controlled. When you talk about providing care in people's homes or outside of those clinical settings, you've now introduced a significant source of variability. And then, of course, there's people. The ultimate source of all variability is, humans in these systems that we talk about, right? And so this is where that patient centricity becomes a real tactical reality, because I think the success of delivering care outside the home depends on, a number of variable factors related to the patient themselves, the condition that they're managing, and also the type of care that's being provided, whether it's acute versus chronic. Certainly can shape where the threshold is for willingness to undertake the entire endeavor. And also, there's the stakeholder aspects of this. Tahir really talked about this, this particular aspect is, it goes beyond just patient centricity. There are so many key stakeholders that are part of the success of these types of solutions. So not only I think a lot of medtech organizations tend to key in and focus on patient centricity, but the stakeholders expand well beyond that for these applications. The healthcare providers, and both in the clinical setting and outside of it, the people who are supporting, training, managing, troubleshooting when this is happening outside of a clinical setting, the lay caregivers that get involved, more intimately in the process. There's just so many more design variables to consider when you're talking about, a system like this, a system being a home delivery of care. So from an application development perspective, managing all those variables, certainly, an out of the box kind of one size solution is rarely going to be applicable. And so I think the key is really identifying those upfront and managing them well throughout.
Brilliant. Thanks, Melanie. Panel, that's all really interesting stuff. Thank you. Given the time, I'm going to move us on to our second main topic then, which is around the broad theme of inertia. So, audience, firstly, if you set aside your cups of coffee for a moment, we're going to run a poll for you in a second, but I'll give you a brief intro first. So you've got the product, you've got the companion app, you've got the ecosystem integration, and it turns out that still isn't enough. Now we've got to shift behaviors, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but you've got to convince patients, doctors to trust this is the right way to move forwards. Pulling another stat from the survey, apparently healthcare providers themselves believe that only 1/3 of clinicians are currently motivated to transition hospital care to the home environment. And with clinical risk of conditions being missed being the highest reported concern. So, quickfire canvas of the audience. Who do you think will play the biggest part in changing these attitudes towards prescribing at-home solutions? I wonder, is it pharma and medtech solution providers, healthcare providers, or patients? This is a quickfire round. We'll hold for the results and then we'll move on. But it's just an interesting one to see what the audience are thinking.
I think it's unfair you've not allowed us to vote, Alistair.
What's coming up, Nicole? Do we have a winner? Aha. So a fairly even outcome, but healthcare providers come out as top here. Interesting. I'm sure that's going to be different depending on the context, and I'm quite sure the answer is probably all three play a part, but interesting to get that feedback from you. Thank you, audience. So turning this topic to the panel, have you witnessed these headwinds in the market and what's helped to overcome them? I wonder, Tahir, if we might start with you. Given your insight from a clinician's perspective, how big of an issue do you see this really?
It's quite a big issue. Ironically enough, I'm about to talk about provider, hesitancy, but in that poll question, I would have probably voted for patient, because I think patients can really drive change more than anybody else, but it is a combination of all three. So, going back to provider buy-in, it's key to do hospital at home at scale. If you don't have clinicians actively participating or believing in the program, it just won't grow. And naturally, the newness of care at home as a field creates a lot of skepticism. So what I go back to is three major things. One, you have to prove that it's safe and effective to clinicians. And that's been done. There's been multiple studies that have shown the benefits of hospital at home or post-acute care in the home, and that clinicians are able to replicate this model not only for common medical diagnoses, but it extends beyond that to my colleagues who are doing post-surgical recovery at home or oncology at home. The second thing is that it has to show value to the clinician who's actually practicing in that model. And by that, I mean, they have to be able to resonate, that, hey, this patient I'm treating in the hospital only has one dose of IV antibiotics left. Why do they have to stay here? They could easily be treated and monitored at home. And then the third thing is you have to show value of the clinician. So the clinician has to feel like they're valued, just like the patient has to feel like they're valued. And what we find in hospital at home is that providers and patients alike have an extremely high rate of satisfaction because it resembles the old days of a doctor going to the patient's home and treating them at home. It shows you, that the patients are extremely, extremely grateful for you taking the time to come to their place of residence and being able to spend time with them and walk them through their illness and show them what to eat, what not to eat, how to take their medication. And, all of that combined, all three of those really make an impact on convincing providers. But, providers are still a risk-averse group of individuals. And like Melanie mentioned, as soon as you take care out of the hospital and put it in the home, you've introduced variability. So then how do you get that buy-in? And I think the way I like to look at it is, residency training. When med students graduate, they have to go through a residency program before they can practice as independent physicians. And what that does for us is provide us the confidence and skill set that we need to be able to treat patients on our own. Obviously, hospital at home does not require a special residency training program, but it does require some support and handholding for when you start a program or when a provider starts delivering that care. And that's what we do at my hospital. I went through a 2-week intensive program, and I remember it very clearly. I was extremely nervous to take care of patients at home, and my boss walked me through the steps. He took me to a patient's home, showed me how he was administering medications, showed me how the physical exam may be different, and then also gave me different situations where I might have to react to a patient that's deteriorating or decompensating in the home and how to handle those different situations. And that really alleviates the fear or that risk factor that hounds a lot of the providers in this space. And so what I would say is, really provide that support if you're starting a program. And that's what Bioformist tries to do. Is they send myself, a nurse, a healthcare navigator on site, and we spend weeks to months there really trying to connect with their staff and show them how to do everything from patient selection to admission to discharge and everything in between.
That's really encouraging to hear. It's actually some fresh perspective that I think is perhaps not commonly communicated. So there's a sort of stereotypical view, isn't there, of a remote patient solution, sort of packaging the patient off home and waving them off with an app and a gadget and losing a bit of that humanity. But actually what you're describing there is almost completely the opposite, which is ensuring you're providing that sort of in-person wraparound care as well, which actually restores some of the trust. That's great to hear. Melanie, perhaps turning back towards the product. I know one area you're focused on is wrapping in not just user needs, but user motivations and context. You've already covered this to an extent, but I wonder, do you think the product itself can help build patient trust and engagement?
I think it can, but I don't think it's just the product alone in isolation. And I think a lot of what Tahir just described really gets at that. He talked about it from the sort of provider side, but almost everything he just said, you can apply to the patient side as well. So I think it's very important to consider the product as part of a larger system. And in order to generate real trust and engagement, you need to consider the entire patient experience of that system in a very holistic way. So when I say system, I'm talking about all of the tangential touch points that a patient will have with a product, a technology or an application, the app or the gadget, as you described it, Alistair, and whether that's instructional materials, training, how it's introduced to them, the unboxing experience, to borrow sort of a consumer product analogy there. I think all of these things contribute to how a patient experiences the solution and what builds their trust and engagement. And, as Tahir was just saying, for healthcare providers, building up that level of trust and confidence had everything to do with training that they received and information that was provided, and sort of, eliminating those unknowns. All those things are true for patients as well. So really thinking about the product, the design of the product in the context of all the other things that are part of it, I think is critically important. And that's what's going to build up that trust and engagement. Not, the interface, the experience and the design of the thing itself, the technology itself is important. But equally as important is all of the other elements around it, and how and when it's introduced to patients, and how it's, supported over time.
Yeah, it makes such good sense. And trust is such a key issue. I know it's one of Huma's stated core values, even, Alex. So from your experience, I wonder, do you think from a trust perspective, is it something that's present and not to be broken, or is it something that needs to be earned?
Great question. I think I would definitely say that it is something to be built over time. I think that still, although adoption of digital health and generally health tech has scaled quite exponentially during the pandemic, where it became a necessity rather than a nice to have, and that kind of essentially ingratiated us to the general public almost. We went from why would I have a virtual call with my doctor, to yes, of course you can scan my QR code to access my medical record, which is quite a change. And I think that built up certainly an awareness. Where tech as an industry is now, in general, regardless of health, is there's a low level of trust within, kind of the general overall consumer base. And that is especially prevalent in healthcare, which is probably the most sensitive area where you could implement any kind of technology, right? Where are people, most sensitive about themselves and when it's concerning their health? And that's both regarding the way in which their data is used, accessed, transferred, the way in which they're actually taken care of, the way they use these solutions, what the solutions actually do. There's a lot of kind of different trust to be gained. And I think on the question that you had as a poll in terms of who's going to kind of drive the adoption, I would certainly agree with actually Tahir and Melanie, in the sense that it's both the physician and the patient, as well as the payer. And it's gaining trust with each of those groups in different ways. With the patient, it's experiential, right? If you can provide the right experience to the patient, they will trust the solution. That experience is both dependent on the solution itself as well as on the clinic that they're interacting with. The clinic will utilize the solution well if they, again, trust the solution to deliver on the things that they would like to deliver on. Each therapeutic indication will have different things that they want to achieve. In orthopedics in the UK, it may be smaller wait lists. For wound care, it may be less complications. For it may be risk stratification. For cardiac surgery, there's a huge diversity of different topics to cover there. And ultimately, showcasing outcomes and having a proven track record of outcomes is what builds trust with your clinic base. And then if you have those outcomes and if you have the patient engagement and you have the trust to trust the patient, that's when you can really start navigating a payer, right? That's when we start kind of seeing trust with the payer leading to financial incentives to allow for digital health to scale. So it's kind of almost a stepwise approach where each of them are mutually dependent on each other. And you do need to kind of start with the kind of patient-provider relationship almost to then lead to the professional success that you need to create a business that can really scale.
Yeah, it's a great way of breaking it down, Alex. It just leaves the question hanging in my mind as to how long that building journey is going to take. I guess on the one hand, you're talking perhaps mainly around finding solutions to specific problems and products, and then beyond that, once you've perhaps started to build that foundation of trust, there's the opportunity to start seeing where you can leverage the data in a broader sense.
For sure. And actually, one of the things that Dan, the Humans founder, told me when I joined, when we were a very small team, is that it takes 5 years to kind of see a change. And in my head, I was like, oh my God, 5 years is a long time. I don't know if I'm going to be able to wait that long. Here I am 6.5 years later. And actually the things that we wanted to do 5 years ago, we're actually starting to do now. So he was completely right. So I think that incremental change does require a large chunk of time. We are in healthcare, things move slowly. It's not, if we wanted to be something fast moving, we'd be, working for a laundry detergent company or something like that, but we're not. So it takes time and, you need to kind of really prove yourself, but the value is definitely there. I can see us achieving the things that we thought about achieving 5 years ago are the things that we're achieving now. So it's definitely there.
Yeah, brilliant. Chris, let me turn to you. So I think part of the puzzle which has come out through this discourse is also identifying which patients are the right candidates for a remote care pathway. How do you go about making that judgment?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, the comment I made earlier, and Alex, I hope it doesn't take another 5 years. Speed up, please. Yeah, I suppose the first thing to know, obviously, I think with medtech and pharma being a few stages removed from the actual patient, it's predominantly for the patient themselves to make that distinction, the provider, right? But I kind of when I think about this whole space, for me, it's ultimately about incentives, experience, as Alex said, and also expectations. And I think, we know that from a how do we know whether it's the right patient for a remote care pathway? I think there's probably 3 key areas that come to mind. One is around technological literacy and access, right? So, can the patient tangibly use the digital tool or solution themselves, right? I'm sure we've all got grandparents who, we try and talk them through how to use a phone and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose the reason I use some expectation is because just due to demographic trends and we're all going to be older obviously in 10-20 years time, and so I think our expectation of how we consume health is going to be very, very different, and I don't think that's going to be that far in the future. And so I think just generally how population changes, I think also expectations will change. So I think technological literacy and access is one of those things. I think literacy, obviously, in terms of being able to understand how to use the tools themselves. I think access, things like, we talk about health equity, like access to a broadband connection, like is still some sort of a myth in some parts of the world, even like in the US, for example. Reliable internet connections is a key challenge. I think the other thing as well is around the stability of the medical condition, the acuity. So, is this something that requires ongoing treatment? Is it something that requires frequent in-person interventions? And if it is, then that's maybe best managed in the hospital. Where if it's a chronic, stable condition that could be managed more appropriately at home, then that's something we probably need to think about. And also, monitoring, and hence the kind of big focus on digital health, the monitoring of the patient's condition, monitoring for vital signs, changing in health parameters, things like that. We need to understand whether the patient can actively monitor, or their caregiver can monitor the patient's condition in their own home. And then the third area is also around the sort of self-management abilities, really. I mean, obviously, there are different iterations of hospital at home or home health care delivery models. And I suppose some of those are predicated on inpatient and clinician visits in the home. Some of those are reliant on the patient caring for their own condition. So, for example, in the advanced wound management aspect of our business, we're now seeing increasingly patients wanting and needing to have much more proactive abilities to change their own dressings, for example. But also thinking about responsiveness as well. I think, in the hospital setting, fortunately, we have the benefit of seeing the patient every single day. We know exactly what's going on. We know their condition. But also, we need to be mindful of the patient responsiveness to needing to send information, communicate with their care teams. And so, those three factors for me are probably the key things that constitute whether a patient is ready, let's say, for remote care treatment and monitoring.
Fabulous. Thanks, Chris. A really interesting topic. And I can see one or two questions coming in around this as well. And that makes me note the time. So I'm going to draw that segment to a close and move on to a little bit of open Q&A just in the last few minutes. And perhaps just picking up directly off that theme. So there's a question come in around who owns the risk if the patient deteriorates outside of a clinical setting. A very hot topic indeed, of course. Perhaps I might pick on Tahir as somebody who maybe sees it from the clinician's perspective as well. What's your view on that?
So, just like care in the hospital, care at home, the provider is probably the one, taking on that risk because they're the one who is treating the patient. What I would say to that is, you have to be thoughtful about the type of patients you're going to take home. If you're going to take home an unstable ICU level patient, you're probably going to have a higher risk of deterioration versus if you take home kind of the acutely decompensated patient that has a chronic underlying condition like Chris mentioned. And then you build protocols. So the technology serves as a support layer, as Alex and I very well know, and it can alert you to, adverse events in the home, such as, heart problems like abnormal cardiac rhythms, falls, increased breathing rates that can guide you to intervene earlier. That's a huge focus of Bioforma. It's really trying to intervene earlier before the adverse event actually takes place, but then also act appropriately. So if you feel like a patient is deteriorating, if you can make it to their home in a meaningful or in a certain period of time, then you should. Otherwise, being able to escalate appropriately to 911 or EMS, who can take the patient, stabilize them, and bring them back to the hospital if needed.
Thank you. Yeah, makes good sense. Anybody else wanted to chip in on that one? That's a pretty comprehensive answer.
Yeah, I suppose just a sentiment really to add to that. I suppose when we think of sites of care, we typically think about, inpatient hospital, clinics, etc. And I suppose the whole paradigm shift is that the home is now being seen as a site of care. So I think for me, it's the risk associated to that, I think, will just evolve over time. But I think it's something that obviously we all need to be acutely aware of. And I think also the parameters and the unknowns of the home care setting, and probably Melanie would probably know more of this space. There's so many other things that we just don't know about in the home care setting, right? There's all the social detriments, there's all the sort of environmental factors, there's lots of things that are outside of the control of a typical healthcare setting, and so those all come into play. But I suppose the question I have is, to what extent do those both impact on the care outcome, but also potentially, start to muddy the waters a little bit in terms of how successful the care model has been in the home care setting, right?
Yeah. Great, thanks, Chris. One other quick question, and this comes back a little bit to the trust issue. So it was noted here in terms, again, looking at different geographies and, take the UK where healthcare is a public provided facility versus the US where it's more insurer-led. Maybe here we're seeing a perception that at-home care is a way to cut costs as opposed to a way to improve outcomes or be beneficial. I wonder if anybody has a view on the sort of overall sort of perception issue and how do providers and policymakers deal with that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to provide a bit of a response to that. I think there's two kind of elements to this. So yes, I think that virtual or hospital home type care is definitely aimed at reducing cost as well as overall kind of reducing burdens on the healthcare system, right? So that is definitely a driving force. Now, I think the element of improving care, I think it's definitely been shown in certain indications that patients would rather be at home rather than in a hospital setting if they're not suffering acutely. So, one of the examples in the work that we did is during COVID, obviously, we did a lot of hospital at home type work, and we would establish virtual wards for patients who were not kind of critical or not kind of in need of an intensive care unit, who could then be monitored at home over a 2 to 3 day period or a week period in some instances, depending on when they were most suffering. I think we had a 99.8 or 8% satisfaction rate, with most patients saying that they were delighted that they were able to stay at home and actually didn't have to go into the hospital during what would have probably been a particularly wild time. Simultaneously, we were able to free up beds for those patients that were able to, or that did need to kind of go into hospital. And we were also able to double the capacity of the clinicians that were treating these patients. So where they were previously able to monitor or kind of manage 100 patients, they were now able to monitor or manage 200. And we managed to do that without sacrificing the patient experience and actually having a more comfortable environment for them. Another example is, as I mentioned, we're working with Smith & Nephew in orthopedics. In some instances, we're focused on, okay, how do we prompt day case surgery for orthopedic patients? So where you would previously have, a week-long stay in some instances in the hospital, how do you actually get the patient to, go home basically as soon as possible? And again, most patients like to go back to the comfort of their own home unless they need to be monitored acutely. They like kind of the element of being back in their own environment and having control back. People don't overwhelmingly want to stay in hospitals as long as possible. And so I think this is essentially allowing them to have a better experience. And then the benefits for sure from a cost and kind of efficiency perspective are super high as well. And the key point is really, how do you emancipate the patient almost? So how do you essentially provide them with enough resources, education, understanding, which are all things that they should have to navigate their own care episode in a more equitable environment? How do you provide them with all of those things to a level that then allows them to be managed at home, so that the clinician, or really the clinic, is doing what clinics do best, which is take in information and then make decisions. When we initially ideated the idea of a doctor, they weren't there to collect data. They weren't there to, kind of collect information. They weren't a data collector. They were there to look at insights and then make decisions. They were there to look at all of the information presented and then make a decision off of that basis.
Yeah, Alex, I'm going to have to leave that one hanging. I notice we're coming right up to the hour here. Thank you so much for that response. Nicole, I don't know if we have a few seconds spare just to pull up the answers to our initial poll before we close today. And perhaps whilst you're doing that, I'll take a chance to say thank you so much to the panel. Thank you, Alex, Tahir, Chris, Melanie, on behalf of our audience. I'm sure they'd agree. It's great to hear your stories and views. So thank you very much. The poll comes out very much in favor of improved patient experience. And interestingly, that's quite different to the results we had. So surprisingly, we had the availability of real world data being one of the key things. But honestly, again, a bit of a red herring poll. There are a whole load of other benefits, of course, which are relevant, but great to hear that feedback from you, the audience, as well. So once again, thank you to the panel, and I will hand over back to Nicole.
All right. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you to the panel. What an amazing conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you got a lot of useful information. Again, everyone who registered will receive a copy of the recording to watch on demand as your schedule permits. And thank you again to PA Consulting for sponsoring today's webinar. We cannot bring you this expert content without support from sponsors like you. So thank you. Please make sure you go to massmedic.com to check out all the great events we have coming up, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Have a great day.